My name is Matt Schulzinger, as John introduced me, and I have to tell you, I am not an art historian. I am not even a historian. I am a biologist by training. And the thing that I really have in common with Keith and Muir is that I share a love of the natural world. I love to study those relationships, the things that are alive, that create ecosystems by their interactions, the things that even non-living things, those interactions that create those ecosystems, that's what I'm passionate about. And so I share that love with these two fine gentlemen. Muir has been a personal inspiration to me, and I have to admit I'm more of a Muir expert than I know much about William Keith, but I've done a fair bit of research, and they were very good friends, and I hope that through some writings that I'm going to share with you and some stories, hopefully I can bring some of those larger-than-life characters to life tonight. Also, I'd like to touch on the complexities of the Hetch Hetchy project. It was a massive undertaking, and I think it becomes oversimplified very often. It was an extremely complex issue, and with my rudimentary understanding, just in the past couple of months, I've learned so much more, and it becomes increasingly complicated every time that I study Hetch Hetchy more and more. So tonight is just going to be sort of a cursory explanation of some of the major events in that story. And hopefully there's much more for you to learn, and if you haven't made it over to the exhibit across the street at the museum, I highly recommend it. John has done some amazing research, and it really does bring to life that story. Let's begin. All right. So let's start at the beginning. I love these old photographs of Muir and Keith. You see them both as old gentlemen with long, white, bushy beards. But you rarely see them, well, you still can't find Muir clean-shaven, but you find them younger, rarely, and I love these photos. Let's talk a little bit about where they both come from. They're both born in Aberdeenshire, Scotland, in 1838, same year, about 6 months apart or so. And it's interesting how many similarities they have, but they're also very different. And when they finally meet, and I'm going to tell you that story because I think that one's pretty entertaining. When they finally meet, they do become instant friends. They immediately recognize in each other that same love of the wilderness. I called it prophetic lenses because I feel like that's the way that they look at nature. And so these two on the outside are very important people. Ralph Waldo Emerson, I'm sure many of us are familiar with. His writings were a personal inspiration to Muir, and actually Muir gets to meet Emerson, one of his idols. In fact, Jeannie Carr, the woman on the left there, is somebody that you may not have heard of. But I'm going to argue that Jeannie Carr is the single most important person in why Muir becomes the Muir we know him to be. She encourages him at a very formative age. He's 19 years old when she meets him, and he had been presenting at the Madison State Fair his inventions. He was a self-taught guy. From the age of 11 onward, his father says that school is a waste of time. The only way that he's going to be able to read and avoid his father's ire is to wake up in the middle of the night, according to his own invention. He invents a bed that's built so that it's off balance, and it has a pin that keeps it in place. And he invents a clock mechanism that actually slides the pin out in the middle of the night. The bed tips over, he falls onto the floor, and that's how he wakes up. In the middle of the night, he lights a candle and reads books that are snuck to him by his mom and by neighbors. And that's how he educates himself. So this goes on from the age of 11 to 19, and now at this point, somebody comes by the family farm and they see all of the inventions that he's invented in order to make life easier for himself, in order to make the work easier. And when they see all these inventions, they say, hey, John, you should enter these in the state fair. So he does. And when he's there, he wins Best in Show. He wins a big blue ribbon. He wins a write-up in the newspaper. It's his first claim to fame. He enjoys it immensely, and he enjoys fame later on as well. He doesn't mind people coming to listen to him. He loves it. And so when he gets that write-up and when he gets that little cash prize, that's an important turning point. But more importantly, Jeannie Carr is actually the person who's judging. She's on that committee judging those inventions, and she meets him. And she sees him at this formative time, and she sees his intellect. She sees what he's capable of, and she takes him under her wing. Jeannie Carr is married to Ezra Carr, who was a geology professor at the University of Wisconsin. And so she meets Muir and she says, you should study at the University of Wisconsin. She encourages him, and he goes. And honestly, without her social network, Muir would never have met the president. He never would have met Teddy Roosevelt. He never would have met his wife, who becomes an incredibly huge part of Muir's life. He never would have met Ralph Waldo Emerson. And I would argue, I'm not sure that he ever would have become a writer. She's the reason that he gets introduced to publishers. But more importantly than that, she tells him to go on his adventures and then to write about those stories. And that's the reason that he becomes a writer, I think. It certainly paved the way for him. So Jeannie Carr knows Ralph Waldo Emerson, and she introduces the two of them. She writes a letter to Emerson, and this comes a couple of months after Emerson had just given this big lecture. He talks about how the future of American industrialization and innovation is not going to come from stuffy professors back on the East Coast. It's not going to come from the Ivy Leagues. It's going to come from talented people who are living maybe in the middle of nowhere, but are sort of Renaissance people in their own right. And he gives this lecture, and he believes this. And about 6 months later, Jeannie Carr sends him on his way to Yosemite Valley with a letter of introduction to John Muir. And they meet. And Muir, a huge fan of Emerson. In fact, Jeannie Carr introduced Muir as one of his spiritual sons, one of Emerson's spiritual sons. And when they meet, Muir is immediately just sort of starstruck. Happens very rarely to him. And he just wants to spend as much time as possible with Emerson. He wants to take him up into the high country. He wants to show him his favorite places around Yosemite. And actually, Emerson's traveling with a group of city folk that were not so inclined to go into the high country with John Muir, because that would have been quite an ordeal. And so he's trying so hard to convince Emerson, spend more time in the high country with me. And he can't. And he's actually very sad. He's disappointed. But they maintain correspondence the rest of their lives. And so Emerson and Muir have this wonderful bonding moment. And believe it or not, William Keith, you might know, is married twice in his life. His first wife's maiden name was Emerson. First cousins to Ralph Waldo Emerson. And so Jeannie Carr, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and William Keith all run in the same social circles back east. And Emerson actually introduces Keith to the idea of coming out to Yosemite and being toured around, being guided by John Muir. And he goes. He brings another painter by the name of Irwin with him. And when he finally makes it to the Yosemite Valley, with a letter of introduction written by Jeannie Carr, Muir and Keith finally meet. And immediately, they take to each other. They recognize the accents. They recognize the love of nature. They see nature through that same prophetic lens that I keep referring to. One author wrote that they both inherited the love of nature that was implicit in Gaelic culture. But in Muir's own words, he said, it takes a Scotsman to appreciate the beauty of nature. And so when they finally meet on their first night, actually, I think the moment that Keith knew they were going to be friends for a very long time, Keith was tasked to boil the water and make the dinner. And so he does. He sets to boiling the rice, and he boils the pot over, and rice just is everywhere. And Muir comes back and sees it. And he looks at the ground and he says, oh, well, it must be snowing. And that was sort of the moment that they knew they were going to be able to kid around with one another for the next 38 years or so. So they make this instant friendship, and they immediately start to tour the high country together. Mount Lyell is one of the places that Muir takes him on his first summer in the Sierras. And I'd like to read a little passage that Keith wrote. It was published in 1875. He says, I set out for the Yosemite, and from there went 2 days further up into the Sierra with John Muir, one of those remarkable men one often meets in California, a very good writer and a scientist. We were 12 days from the Yosemite and lived on tea and flour and water. Keith goes on to describe how uncomfortable that is, and complains about how difficult the conditions were exploring the high peaks of the west as opposed to the east. Eventually he gets to the point where he says, it's a matter of scramble, tumble, rumble, and wallop over moraine, rock, chaparral, rock polished by glaciers so it glitters and shimmers in the sun. Chaparral so thick that when you get into it, your only way of getting out is to get into a rage and tear things. When we get to Mount Lyell, it is the grandest thing I've ever seen. It was late in October, and at an elevation of 10,000 feet, the frost had changed the grasses in a kind of willow to the most brilliant yellows and reds. These contrasting with the two-leaf pine and the Williamson spruce, the cold gray rocks and the colder snow, made it a glorious sight. And you can see that's exactly what he paints. When Muir and Keith are introduced, Keith immediately takes to the way that Muir talks about nature. And in fact, Brother Cornelius, who is the foremost expert on Keith, the historian on Keith, writes about the period where Keith starts to paint after this introduction as the Muir-Keith period. Keith tries to paint with the accuracy that Muir tries to describe those mountains. And you'll notice that Keith goes through different phases of his career. If you're familiar with Keith, and I'm sure many of you are more familiar with Keith than I am, you'll notice that there are changes as his career progresses, as he gains more confidence. But when he meets Muir, he chooses to paint with that accuracy. He chooses to take all those details in and put them on the canvas. And so as their friendship is blossoming, one of their good friends, James Mitchell Clark, described their friendship as one in which this deep affection and admiration was expressed through a kind of verbal boxing, counter-jibe answering jibe, counter-insult responding to insult. And this becomes characteristic of their friendship for the rest of their lives. They're always teasing one another. And Muir is known for giving you a piece of his mind without you asking for it. He's well known for this. But he gives as good as he gets. And I think that's why they got along so well. It was a natural friendship. But more importantly than that, really it is those ideals of truth and beauty and the glory of nature that bonds these two gentlemen. I really love this painting, and I was reading a passage that Keith wrote, and again, I'm reading Keith's sometimes for the first time now. I love his writing. I love his writing style. Muir is obviously well known for his writing, but Keith was very talented. And I'd love to read a passage that he wrote about trying to paint Yosemite and all the challenges that ensue. This was published in the Overland Monthly, also in 1875. He says, "Yosemite has yet to be painted. Painters' visits of a month or so have not done it. Time is required to take it in and digest it, or else the inevitable result will be artistic dyspepsia in the shape of the conventional yellow and red rocks, which perhaps is the reason for the average Californian's disgust of Yosemite paintings. The cliffs are neither red nor yellow, but an indescribable shifting gray, changing and shifting even as you look. The lightness and evanescence of the morning gray and the burnishing light of the evening sun are not to be gotten by a lucky it. A French painter of the first rank would rejoice in this richness of gray, but French painters do not paint mountain pictures. We have had some cloudy, foggy days when the tops of the cliffs would be hidden in places. Others would seem to be moving up and out of the fog cloud. Sometimes the wind would tear into shreds the shifting fog masses, until they looked like torn cobwebs, and out and in the Yosemite Falls would weave. In a slow and downward motion, distinguished from the clouds not only by its shape and capacity in the thickest places. It all looks very deep and dark in tone, yet overall is the lightness of grayness, which you can only know by trying to mix the different tones. A hasty dash will approximate only the truth of its color. Try again, and if at first you don't succeed, try again, is a very good motto to calm your rising agitation. And you can tell that Keith spends so much time and effort to accurately show Yosemite. In fact, he does such a wonderful job, I think that's why we still celebrate him. He portrays these wild places in such a way that truly demonstrates their beauty in a true and honest way. Later on in his career, he starts to take more liberties, and Muir has some harsh critiques of that. We'll get to that later. I'm going to constantly talk about how much they tease each other. I think it's one of the really fun parts about their relationship. But they were also very supportive. They believed in what the other was doing. And Tuolumne Meadows is one place that they absolutely shared a love for. While this is not the mountain painting that Keith shares from Muir, Muir actually is giving his first talk one night. It's his first lecture, and he's pretty nervous. He goes to this lecture hall, and it's a big, important lecture. And he gets up on the stage, and he immediately says to the crowd, "Well, guys, this is my first talk. I don't think it's going to go very well. I know the mountains, but I'm not an orator. I can't do this. But I'm going to do my best, and hopefully we'll get somewhere together." But his friend William Keith had actually arranged to help him out that night. And in the back of the auditorium, he placed a painting, one of Muir's favorite paintings of Keith's, of the mountains. And he said, "If you ever lose your place, Johnny, just look to the mountains, and you'll be home again." So true story, he placed the painting in the back, and Muir, after giving this introduction, the crowd is, like murmuring loudly that they're upset with this presenter. Muir sees the painting and regains his composure and lectures as if he's home again in the mountains. And at the end of the night, he receives the standing ovation, this amazing review in the San Francisco Chronicle, and a very healthy career of talking continues from that point on. But it shows how supportive they were of one another, despite teasing relentlessly. Mount Shasta was another of their favorite places to travel. Muir climbs Mount Shasta, I believe, 3 times. And every time, he feels as if he's rejuvenated in spirit coming down. In fact, one time Muir has many close calls. He gets lucky more than he's good. That's not true. He's a great mountaineer, but he does get lucky a few times. And in fact, climbing down Mount Shasta, he gets hit by a huge storm that he is, I would argue, unprepared for. And in order to stay warm and basically to survive the night, he actually finds a hot spring. And the hot spring was so hot, on one side he was burning, and on the other side he was freezing. And he would just turn over like a rotisserie chicken and try to stay awake and alive all night. Mount Shasta was one of those special places that Keith and Muir shared together. But I want to tell you a different story, actually, of a different mountain, Mount Rainier. So in the middle of Muir's career, before he really becomes an advocate, before he's really an activist, he actually marries Louis Strentzel. And Jeannie Carr, that person that I said was so important to him, is the one who made that introduction. She meets Louis Strentzel at what I guess I could summarize as saying a responsible agriculture meeting. And she's politically minded, and she's intelligent, and she's capable. And she knows this is it. This is the match made in heaven. This is going to be John Muir's partner. At this point, Muir's in his 30s. He's living alone in the Yosemite Valley. He's got glaciers to keep him company. He's perfectly satisfied. But Jeannie Carr has different plans. She thinks it's time for him to settle down. And so she makes this introduction. She throws a party. She's now has moved her family from Wisconsin to Oakland. She throws a party. She invites the Strenzels, Louis and her parents, and she invites John Muir. And this is it. This is the fateful meeting. She's really excited. And actually, they do meet that night, Louis and Muir. But in fact, it's actually Louis' dad, the farmer, the rancher, who hits it off with John Muir. And they talk all night about the differences between wild fruit and cultivated fruit, and the joys of botany and horticulture. And they just fall in, great friendship immediately. Strentzel invites Muir to visit, and about a year goes by, which is nothing in Muir time, right? He's always off on gallivanting somewhere. He finally takes him up on the offer, and that's when he meets Louis, and they fall in love. 5 years later, they're married. Again, nothing in Muir time, right? And actually, at this point forward, Muir wants to be a provider. He wants to be a good son-in-law. And so he begins working on the family ranch. For about 7 years, full-time, he's managing the ranch. And he makes it very profitable. In addition to inventor, writer, glaciologist, he becomes this very astute businessman. There are many aspects to his life. And this one, he doesn't enjoy very much, but he's good at it. And so he makes his father-in-law more money than he knows what to do with, and Louis and Muir don't really have to worry about money anymore. This fruit ranch is huge and very profitable. But at the end of this 7-year period, he writes to his brother and he says, "I'm nerve-shaken and lean as a crow, loaded with care, work, and worry." I think that's something we can relate to, right? And he's feeling what Louis would describe as low altitude sickness. Let's get back up. And so after this period, she arranges a visit. She gets a professor to invite John Muir on a trip and say, Muir, we really need your expertise to study the plants of Lake Tahoe. And they did not need his expertise. But he goes on this trip, finally gets him out of the house, and finally gets him back up into the mountains. And the trip gets longer and longer. He doesn't want to come home. He wants to explore more mountains. And eventually meets up with Keith. And they go to Mount Rainier. And they have this pretty epic journey, in fact. They meet up with this ragtag group. It's a principal of a school, a lawyer, a teenage boy named Booth, and a photographer, actually. And they get some amazing photography of the top of Mount Rainier, some of the first early pictures of the top of the mountain. And they decide they're going to climb Mount Rainier. And Muir, I would argue, is recklessly confident whenever he goes on a trip. But for once, he's not sure they're going to make it to the top. It's a pretty ragtag crew, and he doesn't know Mount Rainier. And they set off, hoping for the best. Thinks, I can probably get them close. And on the first night, they're all eating the food, everything's going wonderfully, and everybody falls very ill. Muir describes it as there being poison in every pot. And they are just horribly sick, incapacitated. This is the first night of their journey. Off they set the next morning, tired and very uncomfortable, but they continue, and they make it. And they're feeling better by the end of the day. They get to somewhere called what they call Fairy Pool, and they just saw the reflection of the trees and the sky and the mountain was so glorious that their trip's turning around. Everything's going to be okay. Just when they think that's about to happen, the pack animals decide that they are going to revolt. And they start to buck and bray. So supplies are flying everywhere. Pots, pans, food. So Muir doesn't bring much with him into the mountains, but he brings one treat this time. He loves this specific box of crackers. He's so excited about his specific box of crackers. And that is the first thing to go flying off the mule and directly into that wonderful fairy pool that I just described to you. And so now everybody's really forlorn. They just had a terrible first night. They thought things were turning around, and now the second night's not much better. And actually, their food from the second night gets everybody sick again. And in order to keep the spirits up, Willie and Johnny, as they were so wonderfully known, start to dance and sing Scottish jigs in order to entertain the group around the campfire. Believe it or not. And they're just trying to infuse energy into this party so that maybe they can make it to the top of Mount Rainier. Second night is over. In the morning, nobody feels like hiking. They're exhausted, but they slowly do make some progress. They get a very late start, and they make it up to where they think they're going to have a nice, safe spot to camp. And instead of that, it is actually blowing horrible, acrid, sulfuric air at them. And they have no wind protection whatsoever, so they're trying to dig holes in the ground so that they can just sleep in peace. Nobody sleeps very well. This is night 3 now, and in the morning of night 4, they're choosing the summit. They're close, and everybody is exhausted and miserable from this whole trip, but they're going to try. And so Muir is leading them up a very steep canyon. Muir's well known for his climbing ability. He's also very well known for not understanding how poor everyone else's climbing ability is in comparison to his. And so he's choosing to sort of drive the herd up this canyon that's incredibly steep. And there's boulders and rocks just tumbling at them the whole time. Muir's sure of footing. He's showing people where to put their hands, where to put their feet. They're climbing up this canyon. They make it through this harrowing journey, and they're getting really close. They're just a few hours from the summit now. Everyone is exhausted, but they're so close that they're ready to continue. They finally get to the top, but before they do, Booth, the teenager, is exhausted. He can't take another step. He says, just come and get me on your way back down. I can't make it. And so he's just resting. He's just lying spread eagle on the ground. The party says, okay, Booth, hopefully we'll find you on the way back down. And they make it up to the top. And at the top, it's all of those challenges that they faced. The catharsis is so sincere and sweet. They can feel it. They love it. And everybody's celebrating and just rejoicing. But right then, Muir turns around, sees in the distance a terrible storm heading their way, and he says, okay, fun's over. Let's go back down the mountain. and everybody is with him. And just as they turn around, they set off to go back down. Booth catches up with everybody. He made it, and he's exhausted. He's so exhausted he can't celebrate. But he gets to the top, and everybody's celebrating for him, basically. And now, at this point, Muir is saying, "Great job, Booth. We really have to get down the mountain now." And they do make it back down. They make it back to tree line. And this night, for the first time, everyone's gathered around the campfire, devouring all of their canned food, and nobody gets sick. It's this wonderful cherry on top of their trip. So the whole point of this story is actually what I think is so amazing about Louie, Muir's wife. This whole time, after she arranged this trip for Muir, when he comes back down to Martinez at the end of his journey, she had arranged to have part of the ranch leased off and sold so that he'll never have to work on that fruit ranch ever again. And even though she's a homebody, she doesn't understand his desire to travel. She has no interest in it. She encourages that in him. She knows how important that is to him. She calls it his noble life that she wanted for him. And so when he gets back, he is nothing but appreciative, and it shows how well suited they were for each other. Jeannie Carr, believe it or not, right again.
Question.
Yes, absolutely.
How high is Rainier? Weren't they running out of oxygen?
No, it wasn't that high. I want to say it is somewhere in the, somewhere, above 14, not quite 15. So you'll notice that this painting is remarkably different from the first Keith that I showed you. It is that it's less accurate. It's less scientifically accurate, the way that Muir would have loved it. And that is one thing that Muir really appreciates in Keith's early work. And in fact, Muir is very supportive of photography, because what could possibly be more accurate than actually capturing the way it looks? He's less interested in artistic renderings of something. He wants nature to be preserved the way that it is. It makes sense knowing Muir. And you'll notice that Keith later on becomes more focused on the way it makes him feel almost. The details are less sharp. And in fact, he starts to add glaciers where there are no glaciers, and rivers where there are no rivers, which Muir is not enthralled with. In fact, when Keith becomes more mature and more confident and starts making those decisions, Muir says, one time he's looking at a sunrise, and he says, Keith, you've never seen a sunrise like that. Why in the deuce don't you just imitate nature? And William Keith turns back to Muir, and he says, look here now, John, if you go out early tomorrow morning and look towards the east, you'll see nature imitating my sunrise. And it's that sort of repartee that I really admire about the two. In fact, my favorite of these examples, later on, Muir chides that Keith is taking all the details out of his work. And he says, Keith, why don't you put the details back in your paintings? And Keith turns back to Muir and says, hey Muir, why don't you take all the details out of your writing? I really love these photographs of Keith, and I have a couple more. You can see in his studio in San Francisco, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with the effects the 1906 earthquake has on William Keith personally. His studio is destroyed during that time, and over 3,000 paintings are lost. And in fact, it sounds as though Keith never really fully recovers health-wise, perhaps from the stress or the strain or just the ability that he has to work extremely hard to try to replace some of those paintings, but he's exhausted. He never fully recovers. It was a huge toll on him. And on a very different note, much more happy, sorry. One time, Muir, again chiding Keith, invites Keith and Hill to visit Muir Glacier up in Glacier Bay, Alaska. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this story. But Glacier Bay is one of Muir's favorite places. He gets to travel there 4 times. And when he brings both Hill, another famous painter, and Keith to paint the glacier, he's really excited to see which of them will do it justice. He sees Keith's rendition of the glacier and he hates it. And he tells Keith to his face how much he hates the way that he's painted the ice. And instead he says, he's lauding Hill's representation. Do you see, Keith? Do you see what Hill is doing with the ice? Why don't you paint more like that? Yeah, Really would be fun to have him as a peanut gallery. This, I think, is an amazing restored photograph of Lynn Keith. Towards the end of their lives, their professional lives go a little bit in different ways. Again, Keith focused more on maturing as an artist, and Muir really focused on his writings and his travels. But they do intersect time and time again. And in fact, they actually plan a huge trip all through Europe. They want to travel through Europe together. They want to see their home country. They want to go to Scotland together, and they're going to explore. And in fact, this is just before the World's Fair. Muir goes to the World's Fair where Keith's paintings are on display. And he sees Muir's work, or he sees Keith's work, excuse me, and Muir says, "Oh, that's not his best." And during this time, Keith and his wife are also planning to go to Europe and wait for Muir there. But Muir's always getting caught up. People always want to have him give them a lecture or take him to a nice dinner. And Muir does not ever say no. Anytime somebody's willing to listen, he's willing to talk. So he's constantly getting waylaid by people that want to spend time with him. And so Keith and his wife depart to Europe. And they're waiting for Muir, and they're writing letters, meet us in this location, and then they move on. And by the time Muir catches up, he's always one stop behind. He never catches up to them while they're in Europe. They have completely separate European vacations, even though they planned it together, which I think is really funny. When Keith passes in 1911, Muir has just lost many friends. And he's hit particularly hard by the passing of Keith, and later on by the passing of the Hookers and the passing of, the name is now escaping me. Also the Bidwells in 1900, John Bidwell passes. And he's starting to lose a lot of friends. And at one point he writes in a letter, "I wonder, as I look at the trees, if the leaves feel sorrow when they see their brothers and sisters falling to the ground." He writes that after Keith's passing. And it really shows that kindred spirit. It really does. This is actually the only photo that I have ever seen of Muir sitting inside his house, which is where I work in Martinez. The John Muir National Historic Site, we don't have very many original pieces, but that desk that he's sitting at is where he wrote 11 of his 12 books and hundreds of magazine articles. And if you guys are ever in the area, please come on by. Stop by Martinez and come visit. We're completely free of charge. So if that was what was deterring you, don't let it deter you any longer. And now I'd like to talk a little bit, very briefly, I realize I've rambled on, about Hetch Hetchy. Again, this is a very cursory introduction. It's a very complicated, it's a long story. But this is my understanding. And please go visit the exhibit. You'll learn even more than I can share with you right now. Muir wrote in 1871 after his first visit to Hetch Hetchy. And this is a painting by Keith of the Hetch Hetchy Valley. In 1907, they go and visit together with the intent of both artistically representing the valley, to try to get popular support to protect Hetch Hetchy from the dam that was proposed. Muir invites Keith to paint, and Muir chooses to paint with words. And they're going to try to protect this valley. And when Muir finally sees it for the first time, he's blown away. And he wrote, "Imagine yourself in Hetch Hetchy. It is a bright day in June. The air is drowsy with flies. The pines sway dreamily, and you are sunk shoulder deep in grasses and flowers." And this is the idea, this is the image that he wants to present. He wants people to feel about Hetch Hetchy the way he and Keith do. They took 2 trips to Hetch Hetchy, the first in 1895, which sounds like quite a harrowing journey. In fact, they go up, they bring some pack animals with them to drop off a ton of food, and then they're going to explore. They have a base camp set up, and they're going to explore all through the Hetch Hetchy Valley. And upon probably their second day out of, I think, a 9-day trip, they return, and bears have eaten all of their food. And the pack animals they've left. They're down in the valley. They're coming back in 9 days or 7 days to resupply them. And Muir, unwilling to be stopped, scrounges together what he can. He's still going to explore Hetch Hetchy. And Keith follows. And they do explore, and on that 9th day, they're so excited. The food is coming, Keith is starving. And they're hiking across this snow-laden terrain, and they're making it to the top of this hill where they're going to meet the pack animals. And Keith sees them, and he's so excited. And right then, he loses his footing and slides all the way back down into the valley. And he then, very dejectedly, has to climb back all the way to the top, and is even more hungry for the pack animals. I'm surprised they didn't eat the pack animals themselves. Another of my favorite critiques of Keith, Muir writes one time, Wapama Falls, which is that famous fall, the first one that you see when you look at the famous photographs of Hetch Hetchy. He wrote that Keith had made it way too small. He said, the great masses of snow in the vast watershed that lead down to the brink of that waterfall would result in a thundering cataract, not a mere thread like that. And Keith feigns offense, oh, he's so offended, and then he enlarges the waterfall. So this is one side of the Hetch Hetchy story. People that are motivated, that care, that love the outdoors, that love the valley. And often that leader, if you were to choose one, is often Muir. The way that he takes upon his shoulders the ability to protect Hetch Hetchy from in the impending dam that is trying to be built. But there are many, many players. There are many, many characters to this story. I'm going to really talk about two, because I think those two people really exemplify one side of the argument versus the other. So you have Muir on one side with the Sierra Club behind him, and you've got Mayor Phelan on the other. And both of these characters are kind of larger than life. Muir, I've just spent a lot of time talking about. I'm sure that you can guess where my lens is coming from. But Mayor Phelan, in his own right, is a wonderful leader. He's seemingly incorruptible. And a major part of the Hetch Hetchy controversy is that San Francisco does not have municipal water. They have a private company, the Spring Valley Water Company, which is famous for its controversy. It is famous for its corruption. It is famous for its monopoly. And the voters of San Francisco wanted desperately to rid themselves of the tyranny of the Spring Valley Water Company. And it's a major part of the Hetch Hetchy story. Mayor Phelan, during the period of trust busting, is elected in 1896, and he is seemingly incorruptible. Immediately, he ousts corrupt supervisors, which he didn't do necessarily legally, and they were reinstated later, but it shows his commitment to not having corruption, to returning San Francisco, or maybe to placing San Francisco in a high place, to create the city of the future. This is his desire. He cares about his fellow citizenry. And he is motivated not out of greed, not out of self-interest. Although I will say that ego, I think, did play a part. He is motivated to help his fellow citizens. And he wants clean water from the Hetch Hetchy so that his citizens can be happy. They can have water. The city can grow and blossom. And so when you compare that to Muir, both of them are interested in bettering society. Both of them are interested in making life easier for their fellow San Franciscans. And both of them think they're acting in the best interest of San Francisco and the nation at whole. So that is really interesting. Before this, it would have been easy for me to demonize one side or the other. Go figure which side I would have demonized. But really, the story is more complicated than that.
You say Phelan was seemingly incorruptible. Are you telling that he really was?
No, yeah, he really does appear to be very, very motivated, just...
but he was apparently incorruptible.
Yes, apparently. Yes, I'm sorry if I misled you. Yes, there's no later on horrible... no, he appears to be absolutely incorruptible. I wouldn't know one way or the other, but there's no reference at all to him doing anything untoward.
Right.
And this period, I think, is described as American politics using capitalism right off the back of the Industrial Revolution. And there's a confidence and there's an impatience and I would argue an arrogance to land use. These are natural resources, and shouldn't we use them for everyone? The mining, the water, the trees, the grasses, these are natural resources. Shouldn't we use them for the most number of people for the greatest period of time? That's the whole idea of conservation. And I think Muir's argument is more to do with preservation, although there are some caveats to that as well. I think also sometimes the Hetch Hetchy issue is oversimplified as saying this is the wealthy elite, the upper echelon of society that really want to keep this crown jewel in San Francisco's hands, or want to benefit on the other side from creating the water rights and the power rights. And really that's an oversimplification as well. Both sides of this argument think they're doing what's best for the country. They want to help their fellow man. They want to help middle class. They want to help the lower class. Absolutely. Clean water should be a right. Both sides would argue that. In fact, the story becomes increasingly complicated. It goes through 3 presidencies. It goes through many departments of the Interior secretaries. And what keeps attracting people is the idea of doing what's right. And that's why this issue is so complicated and still, to this day, is still hotly debated. If you guys have questions, I do know a little bit about perhaps the future of Hetch Hetchy, but it's very hard to say. There will be a large court case heard this year, so stay tuned. It is living history. Absolutely. But again, I would be remiss if I didn't add that the Hetch Hetchy project in the end becomes much more expensive than needs be. It becomes overly complicated. And in fact, there were many alternatives that would have saved San Francisco a great deal of money and time and energy. In fact, the city of Oakland receives its water from a project that was set out as an alternative to Hetch Hetchy and would have been a much easier project. So there is certainly some sort of inertia that once people had set their sights on Hetch Hetchy, they weren't willing to give up. It would have felt like a failure to them. And I think that that is one reason why Hetch Hetchy does get sort of bowled forward. In the end, though, it is a massive achievement of engineering and leadership from O'Shaughnessy, from Phelan, from their counterparts, that the project is completed. The valley is unfortunately clear-cut. Roads, railroads are built. The dam is dedicated and then expanded so that the valley can hold even more water. And to this day, it is still one of the greatest controversies in American environmentalism. Since very similar arguments have been used for dams in other national parks. And every time, those plans have been defeated. And the very famous quotation is that Hetch Hetchy once is too often. So even though the Hetch Hetchy Valley it is destroyed and flooded, the effects and the legacy thereof are still felt. They're still felt. And not to end the talk on a downer, but actually, I don't mean to do that, because Muir, even though he is crushed, in 1913 when the Raker Act is passed, and the dam is going to be built, and he is sure that the battle is over, he still sees hope, he still sees optimism, because he notices that people are galvanized. They're not going to let it happen again. That's the rallying cry. Never again. And he sees that, and he does have that optimism, even though he mourns for his beloved Hetch Hetchy. In the wise words of William Keith, he says, "Nature takes kindly to her children, if they would but leave their swaddling clothes of conventionality and submit themselves to her influences. Leave your cares and come to the mountains, for a little while at least." I think that really sums it all up. I think if they were here today, the only thing that they would tell us to do is to love wild places. And if you do love wild places, tell everyone you know how much you love wild places. But most importantly, just to love them. So thank you guys very much. I really appreciate your attention. Thank you guys. If you have any questions, please.
Thanks again, thanks for coming out on a Sunday, everyone, especially you guys. Really generous use of your time. We're going to have a little bit of a reception down at the museum. You guys are welcome to take a look at the exhibit. We're going to stay open in 7, whenever you guys want. And we have to move the reception inside the cure room. It's right next door to the museum, just to avoid the rain, okay? Matt's going to be on board. I'll be there. There's other people here that are definitely experts that can answer any questions, okay? Thank you for coming again.
The rainiest day to go out. Mom, Jackie made it. I know, it's so nice. So we just have to. She sure did. Yes. They're having the first election. Then we go look at the museum and they have a little reception. So we'll make our way now down to the other area. So what is it?